Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon as well. My name is Courtney Daugert, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Network 2020, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We work through a number of different programs, including this virtual briefing series, which is free and open to all. We also have member-only discussions. And we have a lot of educational programs as well as some research programs, research and impact programs. So please do feel free to check out our website for more information about some of the work that we do, as well as on social media. All of our briefings are generally available after on YouTube. So if you enjoy this one, please share it with friends and colleagues. It is an honor to be here today with Yukon Huang, Ling Li, and Joel Wuthnow to talk about the outcomes of the 20th Party Congress in China and what the implications are for Xi's leadership going forward. So I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have back with us Yukon Huang. He is a senior fellow with the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he is also an advisor to many of the banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other various governments and corporations. So welcome back, Yukon Huang. We also have with us Ling Li, Dr. Ling Li, and she is a lecturer at the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Vienna. Welcome, Ling. And we have Joel Wuthnow, who is a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. So welcome, Joel. Very glad to have you here with us. So we are going to start with you, Ling, where we generally like to start, which is laying some groundwork for everyone. So the Chinese 20th Party Congress wrapped up predictably, with the third term for General Secretary Xi Jinping. He was basically cementing his grip on power. Before we jump into those details, though, could you take us a few steps back and explain the basics to our audience? What is the National Party Congress and what happens there? And what was really notable about this 20th Party Congress in your mind? You're muted.
Sorry, the Party Congress is a forum to re-elect the Central Party leadership in a 5-year cycle. It's an indirect election, and it's actually it's a selection process that is presented as an election. So the most important item on the agenda is election of all top party decision-making bodies, including the Politburo and its standing committee, the Central Committee, the Central Military Commission, and the Central Commission of Discipline and Inspection. And there are several other items on the agenda that includes the amendment of the party charter, which is also characterized as a constitution of the party. And it also includes two work report of two party institutions. One is a work report of the Central Committee, the outgoing Central Committee, and another work report is from the outgoing Central Commission of Discipline and Inspection. So that's the main agendas for the Congress. And I just want to add one not small matter. After the Congression finishes, the Congress ends, all the delegates go sightseeing in Beijing or go home. The elected Central Committee members will stay to elect the top-tier decision-making bodies, which is the Politburo Standing Committee, and the Central Secretariat, the Central Military Commission, and the decision-making body of the CCDI, the Central Commission of Discipline and Inspection. At the Congress, they only elect the Central Committee, which is the lower tier of the decision-making body. The top tier is a job for the Central Committee, not the Congress.
And just as follow-up to that, what stood out to you when you were observing the Congress from afar? Anything that seemed surprising or not surprising, that that piqued your interest as an analyst?
Well, everyone is anticipating that Xi Jinping will retain a third term as a general party secretary, but we need to see that is officially confirmed. And people were anxious to see the new lineup of the top party decision-making body in the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee. But obviously, what happened at the closing ceremony, which is so unexpected, it has made everything else seems less significant than it should be. But the drama aside, the selection, the new lineup of the top decision-making bodies, including the Politburo Standing Committee and the Politburo, has several decisions that are quite surprising. One is the premature exits of two age-eligible Politburo Standing Committee members, Li Keqiang and Wang Yang. They were both 67, which is below the age limit at the time of the election, but both were expelled out of the Politburo Standing Committee. And another violation of the conventional norm is the stay of and one promotion of two members. One is Zhang Youxia, who got re-elected at the age of 72, way beyond the age limit. So he was re-elected to the Politburo. And the other case of violation is concerning Wang Yi, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was at the age of 69 at the time of election, which is also beyond the age limit, and he was promoted to the Politburo. So these two cases of premature exit of two age-eligible members, and two cases, one concerning staying at the Politburo, one concerning promoting to the Politburo, against for two members, both of whom have gone beyond the age limit. That's some conspicuous violation of the current age norm.
Thank you. And I'd like to get into the significance of that within the Politburo in the next round of questions. So thank you so much for foreshadowing that and bringing that up. I would like to turn to you, Yukon, right now to talk about the economy. So after being delayed for a week, the official data, I think it was released last week, revealed that China's economy in the third quarter rebounded to 3.9%, which beat the forecasts of 3.2 to 3.3% growth, but still lags the official target of 5.5%. You gave a talk about 4 years ago, right after Xi took the office for the second term, to talk about the reform contradictions that he would be facing. So with all of this in mind, what are you looking at now? What are some of the economic considerations that Xi must face in his future leadership? And how really can he continue to finance his policies like modernizing the military or zero COVID? What really needs to be done differently for China's economy to continue to grow?
What's happening in China is an example of how quickly economic events can turn around. If you go back to last year, China grew at 8% a year, the highest of any major economy. And the forecast for this year of 5.5% seemed reasonable. But the reality is that China will be lucky to grow at even 3%. And the answer is why? Why such a dramatic lowering of expectations? Well, I think the principal one is the property market. For 2 decades, 3 decades now, China's growth has been largely driven by construction, the building of apartments and condominiums. And what happened, of course, was that the pace of urbanization is moderated, society is aging, but the financing model that China's been using no longer is workable. It was based on the fact that developers would take the deposits of households and use it to finance future purchases of land. And this would work as long as land prices were rising. But when land prices started to stabilize and actually come down, they ran into financing problems, and developers ran out of money to finish the housing, and homeowners are starting to stop their mortgage payments. So you have a housing crisis, a financial crisis in the property market. In the past, you could count on local governments to stimulate the economy by expanding infrastructure investments. But local governments are running short of revenues, so they really cannot do that. Third, China has been benefiting from what I call rapid growth in exports to the United States and Europe over the last couple of years during the pandemic. But that's moderated. Europe is starting to go into recession. There's discussions in the US about inflation and recession. So expansion of exports to the West no longer can save China. On top of that, you have China's draconian zero COVID policies. Every time you lock down a major city, growth probably comes down by 2, 3, 4/10%. And they're facing that prospect again. So they're going to be lucky to grow at 3%. And they're going to be lucky to grow at 3% in the future unless something happens. Can China remain financially viable at 3%? Not really. It has very ambitious plans to modernize, become more innovative, become more prosperous. They need to grow to 5 to 6% in the future. But if they are going to grow at 5 to 6%, they need a different growth model. And this is the problem, the contradiction that China faces. China is a very heavily distorted economy. And the paradox is these distortions also mean that you can grow more rapidly if you address these distortions. And the major one is the role of the state in allocating resources. And let me just give you one very important example. In China, there's a policy called hukou. Hukou tells you where you can live. And you cannot move or live in a place and be officially recognized without a formal residency permit. And if you look at China's major cities like Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, about 40% of the population don't have formal residency rights. They're called migrant workers. And although they're Chinese, they can't buy housing, they can't rent a car, they can't send their children to local schools. But if you gave them formal residency rights, recognize their right to live where they are, this would dramatically increase consumption and potential investment demand. And that by itself probably could increase growth by at least 1 percentage point. But let me point out another very significant example. Over the last 20 years, Xi Jinping has been addressing what he would call inequalities, poverty. So a large share of government investments have been going into the far West and in the interior. The problem is the returns on investments in the far West and the interior are much lower than the more commercial areas in the central province and the coastal provinces. And this is becoming a problem now. But if you balance that a little bit more, start channeling resources to where there are higher returns, again, this would boost up growth rates. The other major issue is state enterprises. The rates of return between state enterprises and private enterprises has widened considerably over the last decade. There are about 4 or 5 percentage point differences, and that's extraordinarily large. They used to be the same 15 years ago, but now there's a gap of 5%. So you need to actually reform the way money is being channeled between state enterprises and private enterprises. So if China did this, you could grow 5 to 6% in the future. But there's also a huge problem coming. China wants to become more self-sufficient, particularly innovation technology that costs a lot of money, but the returns don't occur until, let's say, a decade from now. So the growth rate actually is going to come down a little bit, even because China wants to become more innovative. And this is a huge challenge for China.
Great, thank you, Yukon. You just mentioned, I think, a lot of interesting observations that I think will have implications for both of what Ling and Joel will talk about too. And so I hope that we can get into that a little bit later, whether in the Q&A or in the next questions. But Joel, just turning to you now, the 20th Party Congress political report included a revamped section on China's military modernization and national defense that is longer and features notable changes compared to the 19th Party Congress report. Can you tell us about the current capability of the PLA? What are China's short-term and long-term goals for the PLA? And do you see any major changes in PLA politics after this most recent Party Congress?
Sure. Thanks, Courtney, and good morning, everyone. So I would say, first of all, is that when we talk about the PLA, China's military, I think, for the last 25 or 30 years, we've seen really quite significant development. So the PLA of today is very, very different from what China's leaders inherited from the 1990s or even the early 2000s. So if we look across the spectrum of advanced capabilities, whether it's surface combatants such as destroyers, if we're talking about fighter jets, even if we're talking about things like tanks, they have really moved up the value chain so that they now have capabilities that rival, I would say, some of the best equipment that the US military is fielding. So they put in quite a lot of investment into hardware. They've also put investment into what we might call software of the PLA. So in other words, training, doctrine, organization, people, things like this that all contribute to sort of military effectiveness. So the PLA that Xi Jinping inherited when he came in 2012 was very different from the one that, for instance, Jiang Zemin inherited when he came in towards the end of the 1980s. All right, so what are some of the key long-term and short-term issues that the PLA is wrestling with? Well, I would say, first of all, there is a bit of a tension here because the PLA, on the one hand, is seeking to operate within the region at increasing distances, at increasing durations, and so on. They are out and about in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, across the Himalayan borders, enforcing China's territorial claims. And they're doing that on a daily basis. And we've also seen quite an uptick in this sort of enforcement activity. In other words, the PLA going beyond China's borders and enforcing, and sometimes even actually coming into contact with foreign forces. So this is a near-term requirement that requires readiness. That requires them to be on alert, to be in good shape, and so on. But there's a tension here with sort of the long-term modernization of the PLA. So they need to continue to invest in higher-end technology and new kinds of systems to keep them ahead of the curve. So if we look at how they're balancing the tension, right now I would say they're actually putting a bit more emphasis into near-term readiness because they can't afford to be caught off guard. And so the PLA's budget, if we break it down by category, the training and the maintenance side of the budget is increasing, which they need to do because they've bought a lot of new stuff that needs to be maintained. And the procurement side of the budget, so this is sort of the long-term modernization, that side has actually been decreasing because the near-term requirements are so prodigious for them. Now, if we look at the 19th party, or the 20th Party Congress result for the PLA, a lot of the language that was used when they discussed sort of the goals for the PLA is really quite consistent with the way they've talked about things in the past. And so I'll give you maybe four concise examples of what this really means for the PLA and its direction. So first of all, they reference joint operations. So this is the requirement for the services of the PLA to be able to work together. So if we're talking about, for example, regional contingencies, future wars and conflicts with Taiwan or others, the PLA needs to be able to work as a team, but historically that hasn't really been the way they've operated. And so it's still kind of a goal for them. Second, they talk about what they call intelligentized equipment and systems. So what they're really talking about here is harnessing new kinds of technology, including things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing, even military systems like hypersonic missiles, but working these new systems into the PLA's current force structure, so intelligentization. Third, they reference military-civil fusion. So the idea here is that the PLA will be able to leverage innovations and other contributions from the civilian economy and to break down sort of the stovepipes or barriers that have historically separated those two. So this is a matter of technology, but also a matter of cost savings and efficiency for the PLA if they're able to, for instance, buy new things or use civilian transportation assets and so on. And then, finally, I think, what they're talking about is sort of deterrence. So Xi Jinping mentioned a new phrase, one that he hasn't used before, called building a strategic deterrence force system. This is an old phrase, but it's not been one that Xi has been focused on so much. And so when he references this, I think what he's talking about is continuing to build out both the nuclear side of the PLA, and we've seen a pretty rapid and dramatic expansion of their nuclear capabilities, but also building out important sort of strategic but not nuclear conventional capabilities, such as things like cyber weapons or anti-satellite weapons and so on, to be able to deter not only the United States, but also any other US allies or potential adversaries that could get into a conflict. So building, in other words, the deterrent muscle of the PLA. So they have an ambitious agenda, but again, I think the constraint there is between sort of near-term readiness and long-term capacity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joel. Ling, going back to you, you set us up really well, I think, in the last question by referencing some of the unexpected changes that came from the 20th Party Congress. I think you've referenced the removal of Hu Jintao as sort of the event that everybody focused on, but there were some other interesting decisions being made, particularly vis-a-vis the Politburo. And so I'd love to just pick up there. What do you read into these decisions as to who was in and who was out when it comes to the decisions made regarding the Politburo? And why does that matter? Why does it matter with the Politburo in particular?
Okay, thank you, Courtney, for the question. So many people pay a lot of attention to the specific appointment decisions, who gets in, who gets out. That is very important. But for me, the most interesting things to observe is the long-term patterns, especially concerning some institutional norms that the party has developed during the past decades, because these norms are not written down in party regulations, so they're kind of fragile. And it's very important to see whether the pattern is continue to be observed and conformed with. So a lot of things have happened with the norm. The only observable norm that's been regulating the exits from power of all sitting members of the Politburo and the Standing Committee, as well as accessions to these decision-making bodies, is the age-based norm, the so-called 七上八下. And it has been consistently observed during the last 2 decades, at least, depending on what age we're going to use as a cut-off age. But this time, Xi Jinping has made several conspicuous violations. The first violation, it looks ostensible after its explanation afterwards, but nevertheless, it's still a violation, is the premature exit of Li Keqiang and Wang Yang, because it used to be a privilege or prerogative for all sitting Politburo Standing Committee members to stay, and the only reason for them to leave is they have exceeded the age limit, and both people have not exceeded the age limit, but it's according to the official account, which I think is the party's effort trying to salvage the norm by saying both made the self-sacrificing decision to voluntarily retire early so as to make space for the newcomers to come in. But nevertheless, because people wouldn't believe it's an entirely voluntary decision that they decided to leave. So whatever it is, their departure is premature, and it's a dent to the age norm. The other violation is, as I mentioned earlier, the staying of Zhang Youxia at the age of 72 at the Politburo, and the incoming of Wang Yi at the age of 69. But having said that, I think we shouldn't blown all this violation out of proportion, because I did a counting of 42 cases concerning all the departures and the incomings of all the members at the Politburo level. And we have 2 hard violations and 2 soft violations. By soft violations, I mean the party tried to salvage it and try to qualify it. And for all the rest 38 cases, they have all complied with the age limit norm. So I would say the norm is still quite resilient because it's very valuable for the party and the party leader because it provides the party a very valuable instrument to facilitate the exits from power of the current leaders and to reinvigorate the party leadership, which is very important, and to redistribute power among the party elite core in a large scale and in a peaceful manner. So that's still preserved to a large extent. That's one of the findings. If we have time, I can talk about the counterfactuals later, maybe.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd love to hear about that if you have just, I don't know if you can do that in a minute or two, but it would be interesting to hear about the counterfactuals.
The counterfactuals,
yeah.
Yes. So the counterfactuals are the things that hadn't happened because there are two notable marked paths that Xi Jinping could have taken but decided not to. One is the enlargement of the Politburo Standing Committee. He could have introduced 4 of his loyalists into the Politburo Standing Committee without pushing out Li Keqiang and Wang Yang, thus violating the age norm. And he obviously knew about that option because he resized the Politburo, but not the Politburo Standing Committee. So that's a very interesting decision. Why is it so imperative for him to push out Li Keqiang and Wang Yang? That's I don't know immediately the answer, but it's a interesting question to ask. The second counterfactual is the reactivation of the party chairmanship, because that will provide him a greater commanding power, security, and prestige. And currently, with this level of control over the Politburo Standing Committee members and the entire party leadership, old and new, I believe he would have pulled it off if such a motion is put forward. And I believe such a motion has been presented by some of the subordinates, but he showed considerable self-discipline in holding back from pursuing this path. So this combination of radical decision to push out Wang Yang and Li Keqiang, not enlarge the Politburo Standing Committee, and the very self-constrained decision not to pursue for the higher title is a very curious picture to look at.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions that your analysis generates. So thank you, Ling. Yukon, turning back to you, the U.S.-China economic relationship is a huge one. Where do you see that relationship going, given that Xi will be continuing to lead China for the foreseeable future?
Very good question. Let's go back a little bit and ask, how did we get into this kind of very difficult situation? You go back 4 years, President Trump launched what has been called the US-China trade war. And basically he did that by placing punitive tariffs on the bulk of imports coming from China. And he formulated a purchase agreement asking China to buy certain goods from the United States, ranging from soybeans to energy, to manufactured goods. So that was the principal instruments for launching the trade war. And the idea then was that China's had a huge trade surplus with the United States. So the tariffs or these purchase agreements would reduce these trade deficits. That was the assumption. So today we look at what's been happening and we realize that the trade deficit actually has not been reduced at all. It's actually gotten larger. And that purchase agreement, billions of dollars of goods, was largely not fulfilled. So the question is, what happened here? Well, I think that the tariffs as well as the purchase agreements were based on faulty assumptions. Trade deficits are not actually determined by tariffs or exchange rates. They're actually determined by budget deficits and household savings. And the US budget has been getting, deficit is getting larger and larger. So when your deficit of a country gets larger and larger, it shows up as a larger trade deficit. And that will always be the case. And therefore, the trade deficit with the world, including China, has gotten larger. The second mistake was, can you negotiate from government to government what a country should be buying from you? And we forget that countries buy based on the decisions of households and companies, not on the basis of what governments say. There's only one category of goods where I would say the Chinese government can actually sort of like influence it decisively. That's commercial aircraft. But Boeing's had difficulties in the last couple of years because its planes have not been certified. So China's been buying more from Airbus. So that's why Chinese households and firms didn't buy any more from the United States. So the trade war and the trade agreements didn't make any sense. And now the big question mark in people's minds, will the United States lower or remove these tariffs because they're causing inflation? They're making US companies less efficient. And Biden administration has not done so because politically it would be very difficult. It would seem like a concession to China to lower these tariffs. But we moved on from a trade war to what I call a far more significant effect, what I call the technology war. 3 weeks ago, the Department of Commerce put out a directive severely restricting exports of high-tech products, especially semiconductors, from the US to China, to many major Chinese companies. Now, this restriction covered not just products produced in the US, it also covers high-tech products produced elsewhere abroad if those companies made use of American technologies. And practically all the chips and semiconductors and high-tech products of the world incorporate some US technologies. So this has become a blanket restriction of China's ability to secure technology, advanced technology from the West. This is a major issue. It's going to severely set back China's efforts to become more innovative and more modernized. And I think that the issue, of course, is a tactical one. America worries about losing its competitive advantages. It worries about the military security aspects of China's building up its military. But there's also a cost. There's also a cost for America, which is not often discussed. These high-tech US companies earn 30 to 40% of their revenues by exporting to China. If they no longer can do so, they don't have the money to invest and grow. So when the IMF did a study of this several years ago, of restricting US exports to China, it actually showed that there would be more damage to America than to China, because America requires innovation to grow. And so both sides are going to suffer in the process. There's also a broader issue. I think this is the first signal of what I would call damaging or eliminating or getting rid of what I call the global international economic system as we know it. Growth in the United States, growth globally, comes from the transfer of knowledge and competition. So if you restrict competition and you restrict or discourage countries from innovating, you reduce the pressures for knowledge to flow. And I think you're going to see a decline in global growth rates everywhere in the coming years if this somehow cannot be resolved. So we move from a trade war, which is not very effective, to what I would call a technology knowledge war, which I think has negative consequences for both sides.
All right, thank you. Before we get to the next question, just a reminder to everyone listening, after this, I will open it up for questions from the Q&A box. So please feel free to put a question into the Q&A box at any time, and I will try to get to them after this question. Joel, Taiwan. It's always the big elephant in the room when it comes to talking about China. How significant is Taiwan in China's military strategy? And is the PLA ready for a war to take over Taiwan? With Xi in power, will China be really trying to stick to that timeline to reunite with Taiwan? And I think it was, 2049 or 2047, something of the sort. So would love your assessment of the situation with Taiwan.
Well, Taiwan, the cross-strait contingency has been really central to China's military strategy since 1993. So this isn't something new. The PLA has postured itself. They've developed capabilities. They've conducted relevant training all across the last basically 3 decades for this kind of scenario. Really, they have 2 goals. One is to deter Taiwan independence, And the second is to give their leadership military options if they're not able to peacefully settle this dispute, then to use force to do so. I would say that on the first goal, deterring overt steps towards legal independence, they've been rather successful. And we can say even now that the current leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, has been fairly cautious about taking dramatic steps, revising the constitution and so on. So I think they've been somewhat successful on the second goal, which is, sort of using military force to coerce or even to give their leadership options to occupy the island. They still face really significant challenges. And part of it is their own limitations in terms of critical capabilities. Part of it is Taiwan's natural advantages in terms of defense. Part of it is the sense in China that they wouldn't just simply be fighting Taiwan, but they would also have to fight some sort of a conflict with the United States and maybe others at the same time. So I don't think they've gotten to the point of confidence that they could say, well, we can exercise this option sometime in the near term. So on the question of timelines, the date that has gotten a lot of attention recently has been 2027. So this is the centennial of the PLA. And so there's been speculation running rampant for the last couple of years that China has sort of an implicit timeline to settle this one way or the other by that date. I would argue that this is not a political timeline or even a decision timeline for China's leadership. Really, I think this is a timeline for the PLA to ready itself. And I think, U.S. officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, have said 2027 is not a make or break date for the PLA. It's really a modernization goal. So for them to develop critical capabilities for this contingency. There's also been talk of late about an acceleration of the timelines, and we've seen some U.S. officials say, well, this conflict could come even earlier than 2027. But I think, this has been sort of misconstrued. I don't see from China's point of view an acceleration of a timeline because of some of the serious constraints that they're facing. Now, what do we learn from the Party Congress about all this? I would say that there isn't really much evidence in either the work report that Xi Jinping delivered or the personnel selections to indicate that they are moving quickly or more quickly than they wanted to on Taiwan. So the language in the work report on Taiwan was very consistent in the past. They talked about sticking with the path of peaceful reunification. They said we don't abandon the potential use of force, but they've said all these things many times in the past. In terms of the broader security environment, security was a clear theme of the Party Congress. This concept was frequently mentioned, but I don't think they're talking specifically about the danger of Taiwan independence. I think they're talking about all around security, the sense that we are in danger from the economy, from pandemics, from the US, from terrorism. So I don't think they're addressing security just purely through that lens, and they realize they have a lot of other security challenges they have to deal with in the near term. And then finally, in terms of personnel selection, one of the innovations from the Party Congress was selecting a new Central Military Commission. So this is sort of the highest level of military leaders in China. And so they did select 3 new leaders on this 6-person body. And the one choice that got a lot of attention was He Weidong for vice chairman. So kind of the number 2 leader of China's military after Xi Jinping. This person had been the commander of the Eastern Theater Command, which is opposite Taiwan. And so some observers said, well, maybe this indicates that there's a plan to go after Taiwan soon. But I don't think so. I think that this person, his basic responsibility is to make sure that they are getting after this 2027 modernization goal. And if we look across the Central Military Commission, you have broader expertise, and only 2 of them really have ever served or have any knowledge of Taiwan contingencies. So I interpret this not as a war council, but as a group of people who will try to steer PLA modernization in that direction. But I don't see this as a near-term goal, and I don't think that there is much cause for alarm. That I don't think that means that Taiwan can be complacent. I think they need to be more serious about their defense, but I don't think that they're going to be dealing with an invading PLA force sometime in the next couple of years.
All right, great. Thank you, Joel. We have a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A box, so I will try to get to as many of them as I can. Ling, I'll start with you. We have a question from someone who writes, to what extent do US political leaders zero-sum rhetoric and policy positions relative to China and Taiwan influence Xi's power and policy positions? Certainly domestic factors in China are critical, but how much weight should be placed on global factors, especially US factors, and how power structures in China are changing and congealing around Xi?
Well, I think the antagonism between US-China is a major escalating factor to the situation between the two countries, and the domestic policies has never been affected by international factors as much as it has been right now. Concerning the zero COVID policy, just today, some reporters mentioned a meeting was held in Beijing where experts on on public health were consulted about the possibility of a gradual opening up strategy, which I think and hope will eventually take place, because when the society stops generating economic growth, that will impact on the party's ability to maintain a huge repressive regime, including public security forces and other surveillance team, including they have to pay for all the people who do the internet surveillance on a daily basis, 24 hours every day. It's a lot of money to do that, and it has to come somewhere, and it's very costly to continue with a zero COVID policy. So now the real question is when rather than if, but that's a question difficult to answer.
Okay, thank you. Yukon, I have someone who asked a question about what are the implications of the economic situation on China's Belt and Road Initiative going forward? So what role is that playing in the overall economy, or is that more a PR project? And how do you see this slower economic growth playing into their ambitions with that plan?
The Belt and Road Initiative is being restructured. It's being reined in. I would say it's for two reasons. One, China is doesn't have as many resources to finance the Belt and Road Initiative that it had, let's say, 10 years ago. Its financial resources are diminishing. Its growth rate is slowing down. These are loans which need to be repaid, and many of the projects are running into problems. So repayments are not coming in. So financially, China basically has to scale back. The second issue, of course, is China's been heavily criticized. Concerns about whether or not the Belt and Road is creating a debt problem for borrowers, whether it is being used for security, strategic purposes rather than economic purposes. China has tried to, therefore, evaluate these projects much more, to pair up with development banks to assess some of these projects. They've scaled back interventions in various areas. The principle that China was following earlier was the responsibility really is the borrower's responsibilities for the quality of the projects, not China's. But the reality is that if a project goes astray, say in Sri Lanka, where there were ports being finalized, which had no returns, the lender is also blamed partly, not just the borrower. So there is a casualty in terms of reputational risks. And they realize now there's a reputational risk if projects go astray. It's not just the recipient's problem, it's also China's problems. So both in terms of the nature of these projects and the financial concerns being expressed, the program is being restructured in some way, but it's not going away. There's more focus on what I call digital connectivity, standards, streamlining standards. And these are also becoming relatively important beyond just what I call the financing of infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Joel, Yukon had earlier mentioned this, the role that semiconductors are playing right now in the sort of the new shape of this trade war, but we have a question from someone who wants to know how much impact will the new semiconductor export control have on the PLA's effort to modernize and make more intelligent its weapon systems?
Well, I think very briefly, this could have a very large impact on the PLA, not so much from today's standpoint, but especially if they're in the future developing higher end systems that require very, very advanced microchips and semiconductors in those platforms. I mean, of course, every PLA capability, a platform, a piece of equipment, they all use semiconductors. But the question is whether or not, for instance, their next sort of their 6th generation fighter requires parts that can only be sourced from global supply chains, and especially from the United States, or from U.S. allies, or from even U.S. partners. So from that perspective, if the U.S. continues with this route, I think there could be some implications for China. And the question for me, though, is because they are already producing semiconductors at some level domestically, and they have the long-term vision to become more self-sufficient in terms of defense technology, will they themselves be able to sort of move up this value chain so that sometime in the future, they're just producing the best of what the international market can provide to them now? And so perhaps a sort of different way of looking at this is whether in the future, if this is sort of a coercive tool that can be used against China at some point, is this the right time to do that? In other words, are we somehow incentivizing them to get more serious about indigenization of these supply chains? And so if there is a conflict in 5 or 6 years, is this creating enough progress in their system that we will no longer have that tool in terms of sanctioning of advanced technology to be used at that point in the future, because they've already onshored all of that stuff? So again, I think there could be an impact, but it also raises questions for me about the kind of pain we would be able to impose to them in the future if we've already taken all of those arrows out of our quiver now and fired them. What else will we have left in the future?
Interesting point. Thank you. Ling, I have a couple of questions that I will take together. One is, someone wants to know, how do you interpret the removal of Hu Jintao during the party congress, and does this imply that there are no potential challengers to Xi for the near term? And then someone else is asking or stating that many predict that Li Qiang, and apologies for my pronunciation, current Shanghai party secretary, will be the next Chinese premier. Do you think so? And if so, where this could be an add-on for Yukon, where do you think China's economic policy would go under that scenario?
Okay, about the Hu Jintao drama, we still need more information to have a more objective interpretation of the entire event. But it seems the most convincing theory that's currently in the market for me is that Hu Jintao tried to get the documents inside the red folder, and Li Zhanshu, who was sitting next to him, tried to stop him. He put the cover on top of the documents as if to conceal the contents that's written on the documents. And when Hu Jintao was stopped from doing that, after Li Zhanshu tried to whisper into his ear, presumably explaining why he has to cover the document with a red folder, then Hu Jintao tried to grab Xi Jinping's folder, and he was stopped from doing that, and then eventually he was taken away. So the theory, which I believe is most convincing, is on the documents is a list of candidates for the Central Committee members, which the Congress was about to vote on. So they try to prevent the media from seeing or looking at the documents using their super zoom lens of their camera and equipment, because otherwise the list would be leaked to the media before they're being voted on. That theory has to be tested out. We need to know whether other people had their documents open or closed, but that has not been established. So if that's the case, it seems it's just a unceremonial way to deal with this unexpected unexpected incident at the closing ceremony. And it seems they didn't, Ms. Xi didn't take full consideration of the impact and the image it conveyed to the rest of the world by removing a former leader in public in such a seemingly humiliating way. So we still need more information, but the party seem to have denied whether that it is because some political endeavor to try to unseat Hu Jintao from his current position, although he has been retired, or intending to take a disciplinary action against him. So that's not the case. We know that. As to Li Qiang, I'll leave more time before I leave more time for Yukon to answer that. I just want to mention that usually the premier takes a role in because the premier is supposed to provide public services to the society, they have to deliver these services. So they present themselves in a kind of pro-market role, and sometimes very often they try to improve transparency of the governance and the efficiency of public administration. And this party administration has done a super good job in containing the information to the party itself. So beyond that basic line of division of roles, we don't know how exactly the power dynamics plays out between the premier, the government, and the party. But maybe Yukon knows more than I do.
Thank you. Joel, quick question for you. Someone wants to know what you make of, and again, apologies for pronunciation, Zhang Yujia's stay in the Politburo, and whether or not that implies a lack of trustworthy PLA personnel for Xi.
So earlier, Ling Li actually mentioned Zhang Yuxia. He was one of the two Central Committee members who stayed on. He was the sitting vice chairman, one of two of the Central Military Commission, and so it was sort of an oddity that he stayed on. I think the reason why there are two reasons, in my view anyway, why Xi was willing to break the age norm in this case. Number one, he knows Zhang Yuxia very, very well. Their fathers were very close comrades during the Chinese Civil War. They grew up in the same circle in Beijing. And so he's someone who is trusted. He's a lifelong contact who is trusted. The other reason I think is that he brings pretty significant operational experience. He was a veteran of the 1979 Sino-Vietnam War, and he is an operational person. And if he were to retire, then you would have had really quite a brain drain on the Central Military Commission. And so I think this speaks to Xi's larger interest and priority in his military leadership, which is trust based on personal connections and significant proficiency in terms of operations.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'll try to get in one more quick question for you, Yukon, and then I actually have a couple of questions for all of you that I hope can tie your different areas of expertise together. So we have an interesting question, Yukon, here from someone who is, projecting out and wants to know, how much time does China have until the actual separation of the world economy into two competitive models? So take that question for what you like. Do you see a separation and sort of parallel tracks, or how do you see the economic systems developing given the current trajectories?
There's certainly a lot of speculation about creating different blocks, a Western bloc, a China-led Asian bloc, and there is supply chain shifts. First, I'd like to say that if these do occur, and I'm not sure they will, you're talking about decades or more. They don't occur over a couple of years. The first round of tariffs and restrictions on China's trade potential didn't really work. China's exports became much larger rather than smaller. So it's actually very hard to cause these shifts. People point out about Vietnam and Mexico, for example, taking up a much bigger role and China's role diminishing. What they don't realize is a lot of the increased production in Mexico and Vietnam actually is being done by Chinese firms who relocated to those places. So they're exporting to the US through Vietnam and through Mexico rather than directly to get around the tariffs and restrictions. But there's definitely a shift. And this technology war is going to cause a rebalancing of where activity is going to occur. And we just don't know where they can handle that. I think the point I'd like to make is prior to these restrictions, US-China collaboration on research was the strongest and largest of any foreign collaboration, greater than British America or Europe America. So people don't actually realize this. China's citations in journals have now become larger than America's. So when you now split up or try to split these, you cause what I call a damaging effect on both sides. Do I think that this is possible, that you can actually do this? And the answer, in my view, is I don't think so.